There have been many complaints made in India over the last 20 years about the writing of India's history. But I think one complaint which is very valid is that history has tended to be written from the perspective of Delhi, privileging the north, and particularly privileging the Mughals and what's happening in and around the capital. We have two wonderful writers today who have helped shift the focus of history to the south, to a south whose history has remained astonishingly unwritten, untaught, and unknown outside that region. We should have had Manu Pillai too to complete the set, because Manu is the other one that's been opening up this history. But we're very, very pleased to have Kamini Dandapani, whose wonderful Rajaraja Chola came out last year from Aleph and has been a massive hit. And Anirudh Kanisetti, the blazing comet of young Indian history, whose astonishing Lords of the Deccan is a must-read for anyone in this room. And just you need to go out straight away if you haven't got a copy yourself and buy it afterwards. What I'm going to ask them to do is to talk about the two most famous Cholas. Kamini to talk about the subject of her book, Rajaraja Chola, and in that to sweep backwards to the beginning of the dynasty to explain who they are, what they represent, and what we know of their history. And I'm then going to take Anirudh and encourage him to speak on Rajendra Chola, who famously claims to have conquered his way right up to the Ganges and to have brought the Ganges back to South India, but also to have attacked the Maldives, Lakshadweep, to have conquered all of Sri Lanka, looted it, and then conquered great chunks of Southeast Asia. But as both of them, I'm sure, are going to say, we know much, much less about the Cholas than we do with their northern counterparts. A huge amount that we know about Rajendra Chola comes from just one single inscription in Tanjore, which makes these very widespread claims of conquering the world. And I suspect that both of them are going to push back on how much and how credible those claims may be. Anyway, so we'll have a argy-bargy and a discussion at the end. But Kamini, do you want to go first and open with the birth of the Cholas up to Rajaraja Chola?
Thank you very much. I'll do that. And I guess I'll need this for... So I'm going to take you on a journey through time and place into central Tamil Nadu, around the basin of and the delta region of the great Kaveri River, and which is where the Cholas established themselves. And, that was the jumping point for their greatness. The Cholas were unusual in that they had two separate periods of efflorescence. The first was, we call them the Sangam Cholas, because of the beautiful poetry of the Sangam poets that was written, and that was 2,000 years ago. And then you get to the later lot of the Cholas, whom we call the imperial Cholas, and there are people who squabble with that definition, but it is what it is, and I'll tell you why we call them that. But the Sangam Cholas and the imperial Cholas were not necessarily related, but they did occupy the same region, and they call themselves Chola. So they are part of the Chola story. Let me see if this is this working, or? It's working there? Okay. I'll get started anyway. So the Sangam era was about 2,000 years ago all over southern India. And as I said earlier, we call them that because of the poetry that was written by people whom they claim were kings, gods, potters, all across a vast swathe of society. And they wrote about the life and times of the people there. They wrote about the common people, about their love lives, their longing, the fights, the relationships. And they also wrote about the larger picture, about the kings and the battles they fought. And that's how we know about the kings of that era. And I don't know if the slides are working. They are working. Okay, I'm not sure what's showing there. But I believe what we have on there are the names of two of the great Sangam Chola kings, Karikala. I've gone ahead, okay. That's okay? Okay, I hope my memory doesn't fail me here. But these are two great Sangam Chola kings, Karikala and Kochengannan. And, there's a fantastic mythology and stories that have been built up about them. And it's a typical Indian story. It's never like a nice black and white story. He was born, he died, and he had this and that. But, it's not unusual for them to turn into spiders in the middle of their lives and, be eaten by tigers. All that was par for the course. They had vivid imaginations. And we need to take those stories into consideration because this is how they viewed themselves. And that gives us an insight into their thinking and into their world as well. Okay. I'm not sure what's on there. Okay, so why am I talking about these Sangam Chola kings, and when are we ever going to talk about Rajaraja? Because that's the name of my book. The Cholas were grand genealogy constructors. They said we are descended from the sun and then from Manu and a whole range of fantastical characters, both mythological, proto-historical, actual historical, and then, their line of actual descendants. And once again, they, as you'll see further down in my talk, they came at a time of tremendous instability, chaos, uncertainty, and they needed to do this kind of chest thumping, this kind of claim that they came from all these great ancestors in order to legitimize and validate themselves and their presence in lands that were not really theirs anymore. So, the later Cholas, like Rajaraja, etc., claimed they were descended from these Sangam Chola kings, included them and their stories about being descended from spiders and being eaten up by tigers, etc., in their genealogies. So they are a part of the Chola story, and they do give you a window into, the propaganda that they indulged in to make themselves what they wanted everybody to believe that they were. Again, what's that? Oh, cartoon, yes. So this was what 6th and 7th century southern India looked like before the Cholas came on the scene. It was chaos, like it's like an Asterix village, everybody's at each other fighting. So that was the scene before the onset of Rajaraja and his immediate ancestors. And this next slide, I think, is supposed to clarify matters a bit. It gives you a window into the milieu that the Cholas were a part of. They were completely insignificant in the 7th and 8th centuries. You had all these dynasties, I guess you could call them, chieftains, all hyper-local, all vying for little tracts of land, greater than where their immediate neighborhoods. So this was the, lot of the earliest Cholas, okay? You had the Rashtrakutas and Chalukyas that Anirudh has written about so beautifully. You had the Pallavas, you had the Pandyas, you had all these other, Irukavels, Paluvettarayars, Muttarayars, who are little chieftains. And you had somewhere down there, our Cholas, kind of waiting quietly in the shadows, waiting to emerge into greatness. And if you're confused, that's good, because you're meant to be confused. None of this is meant to make sense. History is not a linear story here. Okay, so basically the picture that you get before the imperial Cholas came on the scene was one of multiple dynasties, clans, tribes, chieftains, all vying for power and territory. Most of them hyper-local with a small cluster of villages that they considered their territory. And maybe you conquered an additional village or two that was further out of your boundaries, but that was it. And in the midst of this, as I said, were our Cholas. So we'll come to that. So I just wanted to lay this picture out for you to show you what Rajaraja came from, because he didn't emerge out of nowhere. It's not that he just suddenly, emerged, exploded out of the earth. This was the milieu that he was part of. And sometime in the 9th century, his great-great-great-great-grandfather, I think, won a little battle against one of these little chieftains, and that person is whom we call the first imperial Chola. His name was Vijayalaya, and that kind of set the ball rolling on the rest of the Chola empire. And, to call him an emperor or a king, you'd imagine he's sitting there in Darbar with his dancing girls around him on a throne. The poor guy had nothing like that. He was just battle-scarred, just constantly fighting. But if you read the genealogies, they tell a very different story. They say how he was battered. His diadem was battered by all the people who were kind of falling at his feet. And they paint a very different picture. And that is something you need to keep in mind constantly about the Cholas. They were great medieval propagandists. So after all this, you had a bunch of Cholas. They had massive ups and downs. It was like a game of medieval snakes and ladders, more snakes and ladders. They'd clamber up a little ladder, come sliding down. A lot of instability for a period before Rajaraja came into power. And some of that has been sort of immortalized in the book and movie Ponniyin Selvan, which kind of captured the ethos of that time and made use of the uncertainty and created this grand story of conspiracies and murder and the rest of it. But after telling you about Rajaraja's predecessors and the tiny tracts of land that they occupied, this was the extent of Rajaraja's empire, all of peninsular South India and part of Sri Lanka. And I know Anirudh is waiting to kind of argue about that and disagree with that, but I'm just keeping things simple here. So he set out methodically to fight and capture lands, north, south, east, west, and according to his inscriptions, he succeeded. And one of the acid tests of whether these inscriptions actually were true or not is if they are found in lands that are not yours. So Rajaraja's inscriptions were found in Pandya lands well to the south, in Pallava lands well to the north, Chalukya lands in Kerala. So I guess he did conquer them in a fashion. And that is why we are talking about him these 1,000+ years later, because he did something he thought big. He thought out of the box. The rest of us content with just the little kingdoms, a few villages beyond their immediate core. But Rajaraja kind of exploded all of that. He thought big. He thought out of the box. And not just in terms of conquest, but across many, many other areas. I'm not going to go into too many details about that. You'll need to read the book to find out how he did what he did. And actually, I should get to this. So one of the grand things that he did was building this temple. It's called the Brihadishwara Temple. It's in Tungabhadra, and it is one of the most stunning monuments you'll ever see. If you have not seen it, I urge you to go to Tungabhadra and take a look. It's stunning. So he built this in about it was completed in the year 1014, I think, and it took a mere 6 years for him to complete it. Now, why is it this extraordinary? Because up until then, every Chola temple was a small, 3-story thing sitting in a little village where the Bhakti saints had come a century or two earlier, sung about those places, and they were worshipped by the, people of that village. And it meant a lot personally to the people of that village. That's about it. Now, along comes Rajaraja and builds his grand monument that is in a place with no prior historical, spiritual, religious association for anybody. And he had to do this because at this point, he claimed to have conquered lands that were not his. And it was like a seething mass of people who are surely not happy to be under his, umbrella or crown or thumb or whatever you want to call it. They spoke different languages, they worshipped differently, there were different tribes, there were hill people, there were pastoral people, there were all sorts that he was kind of trying to gather together into what we today call an empire. And just like we have today the national anthem and a flag as sort of symbols that unify us as a nation, regardless of which part of India we're from, this was the symbol that Rajaraja created to create a sense of unity, to create a symbol that everybody could connect to, hopefully, and it was a brilliant strategic move. Maybe, I'm sure he was religious too, and he had that in mind, but I think his main thinking was, like a grand statement-building temple that would get his people to...
With a single block at the top?
Yes, it's actually not a single block. It's 6 blocks joined together, but it's still a marvel. That's not to diminish anything about the temple, and we don't know how those blocks got on top, etc.
I think the fact that many of us believe that it's a single block on top reflects the fact that the Cholas, irrespective of who they were in their own time, came to mean something much more grandiose and extraordinary in the 20th century. And maybe that's something that we'll get to later in our discussion.
Absolutely. I mean, they have come to symbolize something grand and over the top. And so this temple, the entire so-called kingdom was drawn into its working. So everybody had to contribute money to making it work. And, you had your name inscribed on the wall if you donated to the temples. So the prestige of having that happen to you. So again, it was his way of kind of bringing the whole temple, the whole so-called kingdom together. And it had a very grand ritual life with, the idols and the bronzes. These were another thing that flourished during Chola times, the Chola bronzes. Unfortunately, I won't go into that in detail, but here is an example of one of Nataraja, the dancing lord, which was the tutelary deity of the Cholas that came into prominence slightly before Rajaraja. And it's just stunning, These weigh several tons. They're taken out on procession, through villages, and they're the songs that are sung to them. There's this whole ritual life surrounding the life of these gods and goddesses. So that's another reason for this image of Chola grandeur and splendor. And here's another thing people don't know about Rajaraja. They say, okay, he conquered, he built this temple. He also belonged at a very interesting point in history when you had the Song dynasty coming into being in China and the Fatimids in Egypt. And these were all heavily invested in trade, and they had the medieval trade wars then. The Song emperor he made it known that if you were our favored trading partner, you would get all sorts of benefits. So there's massive backstabbing going on because you had kingdoms to the east of the Cholas, the Srivijaya in Southeast Asia, that wanted a piece of that pie, and they told the Chinese emperor that, look, this Rajaraja and all these people are not what they claim they are. They're actually our vassals, etc., etc. So then Rajaraja had to, so you had to do a mix of flattery and backstabbing to get the best deal for yourself. And Rajaraja actually sent a delegation all the way to China. It took about 4 or 5 years to reach. And again, the accounts of this are largely the Chinese accounts. And I suspect they're having a good laugh at us in how they write about it, because they claim Rajaraja wrote a letter to the Song emperor in which he said, I'm a little mosquito from a barbarous town, and I'm like a papier-mâché doll having lived for generations in this barbarous place. And so please indulge me and my delegation and give us favored trading partnership, etc. It's hard to imagine Rajaraja, who's anointed himself with the most grandiose titles. Like, he had a string of titles, that calling himself a mosquito from a town. But as I said, either the Chinese were having the last laugh, or Rajaraja knew that he had to flatter the Chinese emperor to get his way. So they had, in this time, trade guilds that were in action that enabled this kind of movement of trades and people and goods. Soft culture that was established in those lands all come from Chola times and Pallava times. And that is Rajaraja Chola for you. As you saw, he came from nothing, from very, very small collection of villages to this what we call an empire today. And I let Anirudh take over to where his son took over, and that was a very, very interesting dynamic, I feel. I don't know what the father-son thing must have been, but Anirudh, that's yours.
Thank you so much, Kamini. All right, so I must apologize. Will only told me today morning that I had to prepare a presentation. So what you're seeing isn't a presentation that I prepared for the JLF, but for another lecture series. But hopefully it should cover what Kamini has led me on to fairly well. This beautiful Nandi that we see on the screen is from a 12th century Chola temple built by a very distant descendant of Rajaraja Chola, a man who called himself Rajaraja II, very appropriately. And I just found this to be a very beautiful little sculpture because it was built 800 years ago. It has stayed where it was and seen the rise and fall of South Indian empires. And here it is today, watching the moon and the stars rising and falling, and perhaps the rise and fall of new Indian empires as well. I'd like to begin very briefly by zooming out a little bit to give you a sense of the broader geopolitical context within which the Cholas lived. You'll see in the top left of your screen these beautifully designed coins. If I didn't know better, I'd say that they exhibit an exemplary sense of graphic design, where you see the Nandi bull of Shiva and a beautiful horseman and a rider depicted with these astonishing, confidently made strokes. These were coins of the Hindu Shahi kingdom. You can see that there's Sanskrit letters written in the Nagari script on the left side. And on the right side, of course, is a horseman and a rider, because, of course, for the Hindu Shahi kingdom of that part of the world, horsemen were very important in the interactions with West and Central Asia. But I must say that I have lied to you. That's not actually a Hindu Shahi coin. That's a coin from the Safarid Emirate of Persia. You can tell because of a little Arabic word right next to the horseman's face in the top right corner. Just to give you a sense that the world we're talking about of the 11th century is far more multicultural than we might imagine. It is not really a world where Tamil ethnicity is conflicting with Kannada ethnicity or Punjabi ethnicity is conflicting with Central Asian ethnicity, but one in which these identities are very much in flux. And the boundaries of the modern linguistic states that we're so familiar with in India are still very much taking shape. In fact, if things had gone a little differently in the Chola period, the boundaries of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, all of these South Indian states that we all hold so dear might have looked very different indeed. I'm just going to skip these slides without going into them in too much detail. But you'll see in the central part of India there's a bit of a blurry boar that you can see in a coin. And there's also a coin with what looks like a three-tiered umbrella with two fly whisks next to it. This was a coin of the Chalukya Empire of the Deccan, the greatest rivals of the Cholas. And the fact that they're using a three-tiered umbrella is an indicator that they saw themselves as the overlords of three worlds, heaven, earth, and the underworld. And as you can imagine, such humble peoples as our friends the Cholas didn't take these kinds of claims very well at all. And now, of course, we arrive at the Cholas. These are coins of Rajaraja, who Kamini has so wonderfully introduced us to. And you'll see, I'm not sure if you can make out a lot of details, but in the coin on the bottom right, you'll see that there's something that looks like a lamp at the very edge. Then there's a very misshapen looking tiger with a little tail looking off to the side. And then there's two fish. Now, all of these are the emblems of the three different kingdoms of medieval Tamil Nadu. And the fact that they're all appearing on the Chola coin indicates to you very much what Kamini has said, is that the Cholas saw themselves as literally kings of kings, the lords of multiple different kingdoms, who they all try to incorporate into a new kind of imperial identity. Now, one of the things that I'm sure all of us have heard about as far as the Cholas are concerned is that they conquered the Ganges, that they conquered Southeast Asia. Now, I've been researching a new book on a social history, basically, of the Chola world, and I've been trying to get to the bottom of a lot of these claims. Now, that whole absolute pell-mell of little yellow thumbtacks that you see in the southern part of India are sites that I've been studying that have various connections to the Cholas. And we're meant to believe, according to an inscription that was issued by the son of Rajaraja Chola, that he sent an expedition all the way to Bengal. Now, that's in the top right corner of your screen, that beautiful little deltaic region that you can see that has this little turquoise rim. And we very much taken it for granted. Like, look at this extraordinary set of claims that the Cholas make. They seized Sakkarakotam, whose warriors were brave. Madura Mandalam was destroyed in a trice. The prosperous city of Namanaikondam with its dense groves. Panchapalli, whose warriors bore cruel bows. It's a fairly extraordinary inscription. Clearly, the man who commissioned this inscription, Rajendra I, had an extraordinary sense of geography. He knew precisely where he was in the world, and he wanted to claim that he had conquered it. But I'd like to ask you, a medieval state whose average town probably had about 2,000 or 3,000 people, how exactly did they project power from the Kaveri floodplain, where most of these yellow thumbtacks are concentrated, all the way to the Bengal Delta? Now, I don't mean to diss previous generations of historians, but I'd just like to point out to those of you who were present at Peter Frankopan's fantastic session with Joe and with Mary Beard today, if you were to look at the way the histories are written in Europe versus the way that histories are written in India, In Europe, you need a profusion of evidence from multiple different lines to make a very tentative claim about the nature of historical change. When it comes to India, all we need is a few words from a politician, and all of a sudden, I think that generally today we tend to make some rather drastic conclusions about medieval relations and then shape modern policies based on the words of very few medieval politicians. But I think that once you actually think about the mechanics through which history changed 1,000 years ago, the reality that it reveals is far more interesting than we might think. So let's get into this in a little more detail. Here I've collected for you a series of hero stones, which are basically memorials that are set up to minor aristocrats across most of South India. You'll see that most of them have 3 or 4 tiers or registers. The bottom usually depicts a hero being killed in battle. The one above that depicts him being raised up to heaven by various buxom young ladies, which seems to have motivated young warriors for time immemorial. And at the very top, you see the hero worshipping his chosen deity, who usually tends to be Shiva. Now, if you were to actually look at the way that battles are conducted, you can see these depictions of cities. If you were to look at the panel on the bottom right, you can see there's a city with various merlins. You can see there's a bunch of men with spears and a bunch of guys with archers who are shooting arrows at what seems to be a cavalry charge. And you can see other depictions of these medieval aristocrats charging into battle heroically, wearing garlands and so on, into death against the enemy. Now, is this what medieval battles actually looked like? Can we say that for sure? I don't think the archaeological evidence supports that at all. I think that this is what medieval aristocrats wanted us to believe that they fought battles through. If any of you are familiar with South Indian cinema, you'll know that heroes who are in their 60s or 70s routinely beat up baddies who are in their early 20s or something. Now, is that really what medieval battles also looked like, or was it something a little more grounded? Are we seeing here medieval families trying to memorialize the deaths of their young men, trying to give them meaning and trying to, through that, stake claims to political power? And if that's what we're seeing visually, is the way that we interpret Chola inscriptions somewhat flawed? Are we not taking the Cholas for granted when they say they conquered X, Y, or Z? Are we rather seeing them making particular claims to take ownership of deeper historical processes? This colossal temple that you see here was built by Rajaraja's son, Rajendra I. Why would he build a temple this large when his father had already built a very colossal one that Kamini walked us through? Very interestingly, if you look at the inscription in this temple, it turns out that 50 of the villages that had been granted by Rajendra's father, to his temple, had been stripped away and granted again to this temple. Now, was this simply a case of father-son rivalry? It's very possible to see it that way. Or perhaps it's meant to represent something more symbolic. If we were to really drill down and see the way that medieval Indians saw themselves and their place in the world, they believed that the world had a single central mountain and a single great river encircling it. Of course, that central mountain was Mount Meru, on which the gods lived, and the great world river was the Ganges River. That was why, for example, Rajendra Chola claims with so much care to have conquered the Ganga. But having attacked the Ganga River and ostensibly brought its waters down to South India, as you can all imagine, is not a very mountainous place. It's very flat. He had to build a new mountain for the waters of the river that come down. And thus we see the great temple of the Gangaikonda Choleshwara, the Lord of the Lord who conquered the Ganga. But that's a very interesting term that I'd like to direct your attention towards, and something I find very interesting about Chola kingship. If you were to look at the Shiva Linga in these Chola temples, it's very often called Rajarajeshwara or Gangaikonda Choleshwara, which means the Lord of Rajaraja, the Lord of Gangaikonda, the Chola who conquered the Ganga, but it could also mean Rajaraja as Lord or Gangaikonda Chola as Lord. And does this indicate that the Cholas wanted to see themselves not necessarily as gods, but rather that after their death they wanted to be considered to be beings similar to Shiva, something that's supported by the Shaiva Siddhanta text, who could act as a ritual focus for their empires, Keep in mind, empire building doesn't have to be the same wherever you look at in the past. It doesn't have to look like British colonialism, for example. It had a profound ritual and religious aspect that to many of us is kind of forgotten today. Of course, the thing that Rajendra Chola is most famous for is attack on Srivijaya, which Kamini briefly alluded to. This beautiful sculpture that you see on the left of the screen was actually donated to this particular temple at the great Chola port of Nagapattinam by the rulers of Srivijaya. It's a statue of Shiva as Ardhanarishwara, the Lord who's half woman. And you can tell because he's wearing half a sari, that beautiful, colorful green sari on the right of the deity, along with a man's costume of a dhoti and an angavastram on the left.
Where is it now?
It's in Nagapattinam, which is the great Chola port on the east coast. Now, Kamini has presented what is the academic consensus on why the Cholas crossed the seas and attacked Srivijaya, perhaps the one thing that the Cholas are best known for today. I think that there's actually something much more complex going on. I think the Srivijaya kings were trying to make a claim to universal overlordship by issuing the statue in a land that they did not control. And by doing this, they showed the Cholas that not only are they a powerful kingdom that's within 2 weeks sailing, but also they have a lot of money, which could potentially be looted. And of course, that's exactly what the Cholas seem to do. In this map, you can see, as Kamini pointed out, you have the Sung dynasty of China, far to the east. You can see to the southeast, or to the bottom right of your screen, the Srivijaya Confederacy, which is a trading confederation of Southeast Asian cities. And of course, in the southern part of India, you see the Chola Empire. Now, we know that trade had been increasing in this part of the world for centuries before that. And we know that the Cholas eventually attacked Southeast Asia. Now, what I'd like to ask is, did the Cholas necessarily attack Srivijaya because it made all kinds of outlandish claims in China, or because Srivijaya offered a good landing position for Chola merchants to potentially extract resources from Sumatra? We know that up to this time, the complexity of temple ritual in South India had grown more and more complex. All of us who visited South Indian temples know that camphor is very often offered to Shiva, and camphor is one of the many goods that is produced in the islands of Sumatra. And very soon after this, as I'll talk about in a little more detail soon, we begin to see Tamil merchants in Southeast Asia extracting camphor. Hopefully, we'll get into that in a little more detail in our discussion with Will. But I just want to bring my talk to a close by showing you what a medieval ship actually looked like. As you can see, it's not a very dramatic Portuguese-style galleon or something. It's a rather modest affair of wood with this beautiful little thatched hut in the middle. It didn't actually have a deck that we might imagine in most medieval ships. It had 2 gangways on either side and a kind of open area in between where most of the cargo was kind of shoved down. We know from ethnographic work in the Maldives that the Cholas probably had names for different winds and currents in different seasons. We know how they would have measured the speed of their ships. They would have taken a moist ball of coconut ash and thrown it into the ocean, and then dragged and seen how the ash kind of dispersed as the ship moved. We know how they measured the location of stars. They would have used fingers to measure the height of a star above the horizon. And we also have a fairly good sense of what stars they would have used. We know that the North Star, Polaris, isn't actually visible from Tamil Nadu. So they probably used Alcor and the Big Dipper to figure out the direction of the north. And they used the star known as Betelgeuse or Ardra in the Indian tradition to figure out where the west direction was. So it was a fairly simple matter for them to navigate from the shores of Tamil Nadu to Southeast Asia by figuring out which star was behind them and then orienting their ships every night to move towards it. This, of course, is a number of places that Cholas claim to have conquered, but I don't think it's really as simple as we might imagine. It's not really a Chola conquest of the region so much as Tamil merchant guilds who had profits to be made from the camphor trade in Sumatra, who were possibly working in coordination with the Chola state to take over ports that would have been amenable to them. I see that we don't really have a lot of time left in our discussion, so I'm just going to stop here because I could probably talk about the Cholas for hours if left to myself. But let's just pause it here from now, and let's get into a bit of a discussion.
this is such fascinating stuff, but what makes it all the more fascinating is that so much seems to rest on the interpretation of the individual historian. I mean, if we had Sanjeev Sanyal on this panel today, Sanjeev paints a picture of a great armada of Chola. He describes them like loading at Nagapatnam, sailing via Sri Lanka, which is now a conquered colony, and landing in Southeast Asia like a sort of Nazi blitzkrieg, and then conquering it and holding it with Chola viceroys for 100 years and controlling the Malacca states. And even if you take that as an extreme interpretation of sort of Tamil virility at this time, there's no question, just to play the devil's advocate, to push against this, that you have, for a couple of years after the expedition, Srivijaya is not sending expeditions to China, and the Chinese complain, where are all the merchants gone? You do have inscriptions from Tamil merchant guilds and so on all over what's now Malaysia, Sumatra, northern Sumatra, indicating that there's certainly for a brief period a viceroy who's probably a prince who's occupying this territory. And it's beyond doubt, because we have the Sri Lankan chronicles, that they did that in Sri Lanka. So it's not like they weren't capable of mounting a seaborne expedition. If you go to Polonnaruwa today, there's that little Chola temple that looks just like a small Chola, ditto 2 or 3 other Chola temples around Sri Lanka. So there's no good reason to doubt that they conquered Sri Lanka, and therefore, isn't it perfectly plausible, at least, that a full-scale attack on Southeast Asia really did happen just as we read. And it's quite specific. They name the ports. It's not like they're naming the whole of the, Southeast Asia. They name the 10 or 11 ports that they raided. And you actually have areas around the Kaveri Delta where they have the title of Kadam conquering. Yeah. So as if the guys who'd been on these expeditions were coming home and being honored. So explain why you think that's bullshit.
So we know that there were also Chola princes who called themselves Chola Ayodhya Rajan, the Chola protector of the people of Kannauj, but we know the Cholas didn't attack Kannauj or Ayodhya. So we can't necessarily say that because a Chola claims a particular title, that they absolutely had the right to that title. We have, for example, Indian politicians today who claim to be mega stars in young leaders and Vishwagurus and so on, not necessarily with any more backing than the Cholas did. Secondly, as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, and that's a fascinating question. Now, generally speaking, when we talk about medieval conquest, we have one king who says, oh, I conquered this and I despoiled this and I captured people from here and there and whatnot. But it's usually just him who claims that, and there's no other source supporting that. Now, when it comes to
Sri Lanka, we do have another source.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's why, even in my book, in my first book, I was under the impression, oh, good Lord, is that what I look like on screen?
That's your mirror image, I think.
I was under the impression that, yes, because the Cholas claim this and the Lankans claim this, then it absolutely must have been a conquest. But then I spoke to an archaeologist, K. Strickland, who excavated Anuradhapura, the great capital of Sri Lanka, before the Cholas, and I expected he'd tell me that there was a picture of absolute doom and devastation, but he told me that there's no evidence of wide-scale destruction. And I couldn't believe my ears.
What evidence was he looking for?
He was looking for ash layers. So there's no sense
As an archaeologist, I know that I used to dig a lot as a teenager, and one of the things that survives is ash layers, and you can tell where someone's been burnt.
But they claim to have burnt it.
They claim to have burnt it.
And the Mahavamsa claims that they
tore
came
open
and behaved
stupas.
like yakas.
Yes.
Blood-sucking
like
yakas.
blood-sucking yakas. They stole loot from stupas.
Yeah.
But the stupas show very little sign of violent eruption and loot being extracted from them. But instead, what the archaeological picture shows is that Anuradhapura, the Sri Lankan capital, was already in decline by the late 10th century. And the Cholas then show up and set up a new capital at Polonnaruwa, which isn't too far away, and they redirect the resource of Anuradhapura to Polonnaruwa, and that causes the decay of the old Buddhist monasteries, which of course the Buddhists don't like, and therefore they make up this rather lurid story of the Cholas sacking and despoiling and so on, which the Cholas are obviously very happy to take the credit for, because it makes them look like these great and violent conquerors.
Kamini, if we put Sanjeev Sanyal at one end of as the kind of, the Cholas as the big martial race, and Anirudh at the other as the skeptic,
Yes.
where do you stand on that?
I think I'm squarely in the middle, because I think yours is a bit of a case of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And I'm also not that rosy about the whole thing, but something must have happened. Maybe we're all right, maybe we're all wrong. I mean, this much of time later, it's not possible to say. But, the fact that they built a temple like that, they were grander than what they started out from, and they were grander than many of their surrounding, polities. So I think...
And they build the biggest temples.
Exactly, and they did send these trade delegations. And so the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And you have made this analogy, Anirudh, about, the way they project themselves, the way we do today on social media. It's vastly exaggerated. It looks like we're always
at parties.
Always at parties.
Always at literary festivals.
Exactly, always looking perfect. And the truth is far more mundane. So it is with the Cholas. They had to do that, but there was something backing it, I feel.
No, I completely agree that there's something astonishing happening. There are these men who are essentially the grandsons of these little village, jumped up little warlords, who are mobilizing resources at a scale that had never been seen before in that part of India. But the question I'd like to ask is, why do kings and states have to be the protagonists of history? Why do we assume that history is always driven by the big men with their big twirling mustaches? And I'm aware of the irony of this, considering I've been trying to sport on those mustaches myself.
Let me put as a Brit, let me put an alternative proposition. Which is one that you also entertain in your Anirudh very kindly lent me his manuscript, or a chapter of his manuscript of his forthcoming book. And you very much big up the merchant guilds, who are these very important groups of merchants from South India who have not only ships, but also have settlements and also have warriors who are hired by them or are part of the organization. Now, as a Brit, this sounds very familiar to the East India Company setting up little settlements. Are the Tamils the precursors of the East India Company? Who wants to take that?
I'm going to ask Kami to answer that question first.
Oh my God, as a Tamil, I'll probably be lynched when I go back there.
Yes. They asked the last question, could we have had the Palestine session in America? The answer is no. Could we have this in Madras? No, Chennai.
Yes. I never thought about that, but... Probably, but I don't think the merchants were as evil as the East India Company. So that
is clearly the right answer.
No, that role was for Rajaraja and the kings and everything. I guess these guys just went about making money, and they had the royalty to do the other dirty work. So.
But one last question, which is important, because this is something now obviously very much in the air at the moment, speaking where we are 2 weeks after what happened 2 weeks ago. There is an image now very widespread here that the violence of medieval India was primarily about invaders coming down, mass murdering, destroying temples. But you, Anirudh, have a picture of the Cholas that you present in your last book, which is a very bloodthirsty picture. And you, while a South Indian yourself, you are not necessarily, you don't portray them in the 100% sympathetic way. That they have, you quote, I think it's hero stones of the Chalukyas that say that the Cholas raped Brahmin women and so on. So is violence endemic everywhere in medieval India? Is this image of village harmony, rich temples, peaceful life, is that a real one, or is that part of the picture? Or is in fact, are we talking like most places in the Middle Ages, life is nasty, short and brutish?
As part of my preparation for my next book, which is a social history of the Chola world, I've actually looked quite deeply at Chola inscriptions, and one question that keeps occurring to me is, if medieval South India was a utopia where everybody is as devout as the Cholas like to claim, why did temples have walls? Why were certain people prevented from entering temples? And why do you see inscriptions talking about people stealing bronzes, melting them down, stealing gold from the gods and whatnot? It seems like absolute heresy to us, living in an age of, I think, profound devotion. But I don't think that's how medieval people saw religion and politics at all. And I think that warfare was integral to the process of state building. But I do think that my understanding of medieval violence has changed a little bit since my first book. I know that that's what the Cholas claim. They claim this astonishing violence, but looking, again, as Peter and Mary and Joe encouraged us to earlier today, looking at multiple lines of evidence and trying to see in a very clear-sighted, very objective way, without trying to allow the sentiments of modern nationalism to influence the way we see the past, just letting the people of the past being who they were instead of who we want them to be. I think the picture that emerges is rather more complicated. The picture that emerges...
You actually have the whole cities being leveled.
That's what the Cholas claim.
And then salt sowed in the fields and people carted off as slaves. Is that something you entertain anymore or not?
I've spoken to archaeologists who've done digs in that particular area. So the area we're talking about is called the Rajaraja Chola-King. It's the area between the Krishna and the Tungabhadra rivers, which is in the central part of the state of Karnataka today. And the Cholas claim to have performed all kinds of atrocities there. And
the Cholas claiming it.
The Cholas claim this, and the Chalukyas, of course, claimed they were valiantly fighting off the Cholas and whatnot. I spoke to archaeologists who dug in sites where the Cholas claimed to have performed this violence, and once again, no ash layers. And more importantly, Mr. Sanyal, of course, makes these rather over-the-top claims about the Turkic invasions of North India.
Next year, I'm definitely putting you all together.
Oh, no.
Battle it out.
But where's the evidence? Where's the genetic evidence? Where's the evidence from archaeology and from multiple other lines and areas that you would need in any other part of the world to make claims? I don't think we have that in medieval India at all. We are making these dramatic claims and decisions about enormous swathes of our population. Other fellow citizens just happen to follow a different religion because a certain medieval warlord claims a particular thing. Is that a strong enough basis for modern day policy and modern day politics? I don't think it is.
I actually agree completely with you. We need to be clear-eyed and clear-sighted about how we view our, the past. And it's not, why do we make them into mythological heroes? Human beings are complex. We are not binary good or bad. We are good and bad. We are generous and covetous. We are brutal and generous and sympathetic. So I think we should embrace this whole picture rather than trying to, slot people into one-dimensional caricatures of good kings and evil kings and things like that. And you're right. I mean, much of what we've written is just from a few little bits and pieces of inscriptional evidence of what they have said about themselves. You do try to see what the other side has said about this and try to create a more holistic, a whole picture, but there are lots and lots of holes. There's a lot of work to be done. So.
Guys, we have time, and Paul is going to kick me out, but luckily as the director of this festival, I have a 5-minute leeway. So one question at the front, this young gentleman here with the spectacles.
I hope you remember me from yesterday.
Of course I do, Anay, I do. He's a remarkable young boy who's
Go
written
for it,
3
remarkable
books.
young boy.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask about how the Chola Empire, it reached its peak at around the end or the middle of Rajendra's reign. So how did the fall come to be? Was it like a house that came crashing down, or was it a gradual or dying, degrading process?
Very good question. We haven't done this. How did the Cholas fall? Both of you, just very quickly.
Okay, I'll go very quickly first. It's like, it didn't just all come crashing down. It was just something, they got so bloated, too big. They were just not able to control the far reaches of their empire. So, so that itself makes you question how much of an empire it really was. So lots of little people defected, the vassals that they had worked so hard to kind of coddle into their midst, force them as loyalties. They they kind of broke away, and it just was something they couldn't sustain. And it happens with every, I think, even whether it's an immigrant family or whether it's a business house, you build up to something, there are 2 or 3 grand people, and then they get lazy, they get ambitious, they just spend their time worshipping, or, that fire in your belly is slowly, maybe it dies out a bit, and then they were defeated by their greatest enemies, the Pandyas.
Well, I will say wait for my Chola book, which answers this in a lot more detail. But it's a rather counterintuitive answer.
Major discounts for the under 16s.
It's a very boring answer, but the answer is tax evasion, if you ask me. The Cholas, through their conquest, essentially create a class of military men who make their careers raising, mercenaries and fighting on behalf of the Cholas. But beyond a point, they don't have enough manpower to continue their conquests. And once the conquest stops, they begin to raise taxes on their home area, which is the Kaveri River Valley. When they raise taxes, villages get driven into bankruptcy. When villages are bankrupt, they still have to pay money to the Chola state. So they sell their lands to the only people who have any money left, which is the military men who made fortunes fighting for the Cholas. And once the military men have money, they don't want to pay it to the Chola state. They want to pay taxes. So they start building their own temples. They donate lands to these temples, which can no longer be taxed by the Cholas. And as a result, through medieval tax evasion, the empire that seizes so much of our imagination today collapses. It's a very mundane explanation, but I think that's the reality of what has happened.